Hello, everyone. So how powerful were the richest men in history? The answer is extremely powerful. These men could shape not just the economy of their nation, but the entire world. And it wasn't until we saw the 20th century that this power would finally start to fade. During the 19th century, there was a huge gap in wealth between the richest people in the world and the average person. So much so that if we adjusted for inflation, the richest man ever, John Rockefeller, would be worth over $400 billion. But who were these men, and how did they get so rich? Well, during the Industrial Revolution, factories and mass production lowered the cost of goods while raising a lot of money for business owners. This led to the rise of some mega-rich industrialists who became some of the most powerful people in the world. In today's video, we're going to look at some of these people and find out how powerful the richest men in history really were. Andrew Carnegie was one of the wealthiest guys ever. Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland in 1835, when he was just 13 years old. His family decided to immigrate to the United States. As a teenager, he worked in a factory and quickly realized that hard work and dedication would allow him to climb the social ladder. At age 24, he started working for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company as an employee, but it wasn't long before he was promoted to become the company's general superintendent. He then used his new position to learn everything he could about the railroad industry and saved every dollar he earned. In 1865, Carnegie made the decision to invest in the rapidly growing steel industry. At the time, steel was mostly used for small things, like cutlery and tools. But Carnegie believed that steel had the potential to be used for much bigger things. He joined forces with two businessmen, Thomas A. Scott and William Clark, to form the Keystone Bridge Company, which built bridges out of steel. After making a fortune in the process, Carnegie went on to found the Carnegie Steel Company, and by 1901, it was the largest steel producer in the world. He also founded many other companies and invested in railroads and banks. At the peak of his wealth, Carnegie had a net worth of $400 billion in today's money. Although Carnegie was a genius businessman, he eventually sold his empire and retired from business. John Rockefeller, the wealthiest man in history. Like Carnegie, John Rockefeller was a businessman who knew how to spot an opportunity. But unlike Carnegie, Rockefeller had a bit of a shady start to his career. After studying medicine for a couple of years, he decided it wasn't for him and got a job as a bookkeeper for a produce commission company. Just 3 years later, he was asked to become a partner in the business. However, he didn't last long at the company and left after a disagreement with his colleagues. Rockefeller then teamed up with his friend Maurice Clark to set up an oil refinery. At the time, there was no real regulation of the industry, meaning it was very easy to cut corners and make more money than your competitors. It wasn't long before Rockefeller expanded his operations and bought out several refineries to increase his market share. As his empire grew, so did his wealth. By 1870, he owned Standard Oil, which controlled around 1% of the entire U.S. economy. With his massive wealth, Rockefeller was able to build one of the first billionaires in history and was even richer than Carnegie at his peak. In fact, at one point, Rockefeller's wealth accounted for 1.5% of the U.S. GDP, which is worth around $2 trillion today. Due to the rapid expansion of his business, there was a lot of resentment against Rockefeller. People thought he was abusing his monopoly position and were suspicious of his business practices. This eventually led to the government breaking up his empire in 1911. But by then, he had already made billions of dollars and donated most of his wealth to charity before passing away. Henry Ford, the man behind one of the largest companies in the world, Henry Ford was always interested in mechanics and began experimenting with steam engines when he was just 15 years old. However, he soon realized that if he wanted to invent something useful, he needed to get a formal education. So he attended the University of Michigan, where he studied mechanical engineering. Ford then got a job at a manufacturing company where he helped design a new engine. However, he was soon approached by another company, which offered him a better position. Despite being only 25 years old, Ford Motor Company was keen to hire him because they believed he was a gifted engineer. And in 1879, he became the chief engineer of the Edison Illuminating Company. There he focused on designing and improving electrical systems. However, he was soon offered a job at the Ford Motor Company, which he accepted. In 1893, he became the chief engineer and would go on to help the company make its first quadricycle. 1 year later, he bought out his partners and renamed the company Ford Motor Company. Over the next few decades, the company would grow exponentially as cars became more popular among the general public. In addition to his car company, Ford also owned the Ford Foundation, Ford Media, and the Detroit Bank. At his peak, Ford was worth around $250 billion in today's money. Even though he was one of the richest men in history, he was famous for living a modest lifestyle. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the king of railroads. Cornelius Vanderbilt came from humble beginnings and started off as a simple sailor. However, he soon realized that the best way to make money in shipping was to buy a steamboat. He then used all his savings to buy the smallest boat he could find. He operated the ferry service until he was able to save enough money to purchase a larger boat. He then repeated the process until he had a fleet of ships transporting both passengers and cargo. He then decided to switch to operating a freight service, but his biggest opportunity came when he decided to focus on transporting goods on the Hudson River. Initially, people didn't think much of his business idea, and he was ridiculed for wasting his money. But Vanderbilt proved them wrong. Not only was he able to turn a profit, but he quickly became the dominant force in the shipping industry. He then decided to expand his business to the west and moved to New York. There, he reinvented himself as the king of railroads and became insanely wealthy. It was said that Vanderbilt made more money in 3 months than most people made in an entire lifetime. At his peak, he was worth around $200 billion in today's money. But due to poor management, most of the family's wealth was lost by the early 20th century. Thomas Edison, one of the richest inventors in history, unlike most of the men mentioned so far, Thomas Edison didn't start a business, but instead invented groundbreaking products that changed the lives of millions. Edison was arguably the most prolific inventor in history, holding over 1,000 patents. Most of his inventions were in the field of electricity, including the phonograph and the first practical incandescent light bulb. This allowed him to earn around $1 million per year, equivalent to $36 million today. However, Edison was far from a one-trick pony. Other notable inventions include the motion picture camera, the alkaline battery, and the electric chair. Edison managed to earn his first fortune through the invention of the stock ticker. He then reinvested his money into research and development, allowing him to continue inventing new things. Although Edison made millions from his inventions, he was not successful with all of them. For example, he once developed a vehicle powered by a gasoline engine. But he couldn't make the engine efficient enough, so he never released it to the public. Despite this, Edison was a genius inventor who fundamentally changed the way we live. It is important to note that although these men were incredibly wealthy, they lived during a time when most people were living in poverty. While they were geniuses in business and some were prolific inventors, they took advantage of a system that allowed them to get unimaginably rich. Today, we have laws in place to prevent another group of people from getting this rich. But let us know what you think. Do you think someone will become insanely rich again? Or do you think that the world has changed for good? Be sure to watch our video on how the richest person ever became so rich, and find out how the richest woman in the world made her fortune.